follow up on what you were talking about, because I'm a psychologist also, so we'll have to talk. And I've done some work in mediation for divorcing couples, and there's a lot of programs that are starting, mediation, reconciliation programs for young juvenile defenders, for example, in which instead of going through the regular court system, they would meet with their victims and they would go through a mediation process. But I think that's really, even though the mediators are just facilitators, somehow it's not completely part of the community. It seems to be missing a piece, and I think it's very similar, but I think it's kind of missing the community piece or missing giving over complete ownership. Even for programs that have occurred in schools and middle schools, kids get trained as peer mediators, but then kids kind of go on their own who are having the conflict, and then you have these peer mediators that are trained, and then I think they take responsibility for the process rather than. So I think that's interesting. I think this film and this whole process would add significantly to that. But I do have to ask, I'm just curious in terms of if there have been kind of less successful events that have occurred or ongoing conflict, and then how do you all address that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, anytime, if any of the questions you want me to repeat, just wave, and I'll assume that you can hear the questions and won't repeat them unless I hear from you. There have been examples of, for example, very few examples actually where somebody came forward and testified and their victim didn't want to forgive them. I mean, really, I'm only aware of two, and there have now been over 140 ceremonies. I'm only aware of two instances. And both of them were instances where the victims felt that the perpetrator didn't fully own up to what they had done. And they weren't going to offer their forgiveness until they told the whole truth. And in Fambul Tok, nobody's forced to forgive or accept an apology. That's just, in both of those instances, what happened was the community afterwards went and met with they were both women, met with the women individually to find out what happened and discover what the problem was, and sort of did a process of going back and forth with the perpetrator, and then found a way for the perpetrator to fully own up to what they had done. And there was actually one case where that happened. I can give you an example in a bonfire, where the woman said, and the perpetrator said, "And I didn't mean to. I'm sorry." And the woman was like, "That's a bunch of hooey. You meant to, and you better own up to it." And then he acknowledged. He said, "You're right. I mean, the circumstances did force me into that direction, but it was, I take responsibility." And so then she forgave him. And so in that instance, part of the preparation, why it takes 3 months to prepare for a ceremony in the first place, is because the Fambul Tok staff goes into the community several times and helps the community members identify what's called a reconciliation committee. Two groups, actually, an outreach team and a reconciliation committee. And the reconciliation committee are like the elders, and they make sure that they're from all the interest groups, Muslims, Christians, men, women, youth, elders. They're all represented in this community, in this committee. And then they receive special training in mediation and reconciliation skills. And then they're leading in the process of planning, and then also in the process of follow-up, so that if a new conflict erupts after a bonfire, they're the ones that the community turns to help them figure out how to solve it. So they're building those resources within the community as a part of the planning process, and then structuring in ways for them to follow up afterwards. And those networks used to be there in the communities beforehand. They used to turn to the elders to solve the conflict, and now it's coming back again, only the definition of who's an elder is becoming expanded to include all of the representative groups. So it's that process that helps to build a resource for addressing things that come up afterwards. And you saw one example in Dabu, where when the man admitted that he'd burned down the community center, everybody came out and started attacking him. So that kind of thing has happened. In that instance, you get a sense of it. They stopped the bonfire, and the organizers and the reconciliation committee, they all came together, and the chief and talked it through until they realized that It was, what the community wanted was for them to accept his apology. So then they started up the bonfire again. So that kind of thing happens. But the networks that they're building to prepare for the ceremony are the same networks that they turn to when problems arise. Yeah.